All right, then. Kelly, welcome to the Ramp podcast. It is great to have you here. We've got some really interesting topics that we're going to talk about. I'm very excited to have you here, and it's good to have you.
Alex, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion, and I always learn interesting things in these types of situations. So I'm happy to be here.
So, on our podcast, obviously, we try to interview a number of folks who have long and storied careers in finance and whatnot. So, would love to begin with just a dive into kind of what led you here, what have you been up to over the years, and what you're up to today.
I'm from the South, went from Birmingham, Alabama to Princeton, New Jersey for college. I was an engineer there, loved every minute of it, despite the culture shock, as you might imagine. It was a really wonderful experience. During that time, really enjoyed a lot of my finance and accounting classes and decided instead of coding and engineering, I wanted to try my hand at finance. And not really knowing the difference between investment banking and operational finance and all the different options, I kind of followed the herd onto Wall Street and worked at JP Morgan for 3 years. I worked in both M&A and capital markets there. Really loved capital markets, which is, I think, a foreshadowing of my career to come. I love the intense days, the market driven decisions, and kind of the sprint. I didn't love the marathon of an M&A project. And I think that's kind of indicative of my personality and why I ended up doing more private company, kind of high growth businesses. And so after 3 years, I kind of oversimplified it and said, I'm kind of bored of thinking about just debt and equity, which is a massive oversimplification of what bankers do. But that's kind of the way I had it in my head, and decided I wanted to broaden out and try my hand at something else. And so I did what a lot of people did then. And I went to business school, went to Harvard, was there for 2 years. And in the middle of my 2 years, had decided that after growing up in Alabama, moving to Princeton, New York, and Boston, that I was going the wrong way. It was just way too cold for me. And I was determined to get the best job I could in the South. And so I ended up in McKinsey in Atlanta. And I thought, kind of justified it by, I've spent a lot of time thinking about debt and equity. And I naively thought that consultants thought more about optimizing assets, running companies, et cetera. Maybe not so naive, but was at McKinsey for 3 years. And I used to joke, I loved everything about McKinsey except for my job. I loved the people, the clients, the problem solving, the frameworks, the thinking, but I didn't love being a consultant. I didn't like dive bombing them and kind of analyzing, putting together a pretty deck and then leaving. And didn't also love the constant travel. And so got engaged during that time. And my husband and I decided to move out west. Had gone to Stanford and wanted to do the startup thing. And I did too at the time. But when we came out here, I had no technology experience, no operational finance experience, and no startup experience. So I got very good advice from a very good CFO here in the Bay Area who said, Kelly, we don't have the luxury to hire natural athletes at startups. You need to go learn some of this before you come to a startup. And so you should go pick a really good big company and learn about tech and the Bay Area and operational finance, which was very good advice. That's what I did. So I went to HP, was there kind of during the arc of Lou Platt retiring, Carly Fiorina coming in, went from kind of the world's biggest high growth company to struggling with growth, bought Compaq, it's kind of a big arc, and decided at that point that, it's time to really, after 6 years there, and I did mostly corporate finance and M&A, but I also did some operational finance and I got a little bit closer to the product and learned a lot about technology in the Bay Area. And so I decided it was time. It's time for me to do what I want to do, which is try my hand at a startup. So the first person I called was Scott Weiss, who's the CEO of a company called Ironport Systems. And he was a very good friend. We worked together at McKinsey and we'd overlapped a year at business school, just calling him for advice. But I was like, Scott, I really want to do this. I wanted to go do operational finance at a startup, but unfortunately I still don't have a ton of experience. What do you think? And he said, Kelly, I think it's a great idea and I've got the job for you. And he was hiring his first finance person at Ironport. I interviewed, loved it, took the job, and it was probably the best career decision I've ever made. Was there for 6 years. We ended up selling, it was an email security company. I was the first finance hire, built out a bunch of different functions. We ended up selling it to Cisco. It was a very good outcome. Stayed at Cisco for the integration work. And then also I actually worked for the Cisco CFO for 9 months as kind of a chief of staff light, trying to figure out if there's a place for me at Cisco. And it was interesting to see the finance team, the leadership of the finance organization at that level, up close and personal. But I really decided that at the end of the day, I wanted to go back to smaller companies and be a CFO again. And so from there, I've done 4 CFO roles. I did an infrastructure, Ironport was an appliance early SaaS company, so hardware with some SaaS. I did a pure SaaS company, a pure IaaS company, a consumer internet company, and a women's healthcare company. And so, kind of diversified. I feel like as a finance person, the CFO work sometimes can get a little rote or repetitive. And so the way I kept challenged and interested was by learning new business models. The other way I kept challenged is like taking on other functions. And so I ran in many of these companies, HR, legal, facilities, IT, business development, sales operations, other functions. At Quora, I even ran the moderation team, and so which was the consumer internet company I was at. At that stage, kind of Kelly 3.0 emerged, and which is me today. And I'm no longer doing full-time CFO work, and I'm focused on boards. So I'm on 6 tech boards and 1 ski resort, actually. I've been on that board for 25 years, but I'm on companies like Arista, who public, all the way to, Alpha Medical, which is a small women's healthcare company that's private. And so I've got 2 bigger companies, 2 medium companies, 2 very small companies, 1 public, 5 private. And so, yeah, that's where I am today. I'm very much enjoying Kelly 3.0, the board work. And I'm, happily married, live in the Bay Area with 2 kids, 2 dogs, and a cat. And that's my background.
There's going to be a lot to dive in there. So obviously you've got the corporate finance, investment banking, and M&A experience there. You have experience being a very early finance hire at a slew of smaller companies, as well as some very large tech companies as well. And then obviously now you're sitting on a number of boards. There's a lot on my list that I'm going to ask you about. First question though, we need to talk about Quora. I think we've got some listeners who actually know how obsessed I am with Quora. I was an early user, a very avid contributor, as a matter of fact. I have been looking forward to this conversation with you for a while. Tell me everything. Tell me about Quora. Tell me about how you found the opportunity. Obviously, it was an experience out of many, many. And would just love to hear about your experience there.
I love Quora also. Let's see. How did I find it? I found it through a search firm and through networking. Actually, I found it 2 different ways. A friend introduced me to Matt Kohler, who's on the board. And at the same time, an executive search firm had mentioned it to me as well. And so it kind of came to me in both ways. I had been on the board of Wikipedia for several years, and they have Wikipedia and Quora have similar missions, right? Wikipedia is about democratizing knowledge, and Quora is about growing and sharing the world's knowledge, right? As a person who is the product of kind of an American dream stories, both my parents were from the product of European immigrants, first people or either the first or one of the first people to go to college. They grew up in West Virginia. My grandfathers were both coal miners. They were big believers in the power of education to change a life. It changed theirs, certainly, for the better. I was very enamored with those missions. And I was watching some of the other media, Quora and Wikipedia are not social media companies, but I was watching what was going on in some of the social media companies and thinking, there's so much power for good in these companies, and there's so many missteps. And I believe in 100 years, when people look back at the internet, they're going to see some bad actors, and they're going to, history is not going to treat some of these companies well. And I think Quora and Wikipedia are 2 examples of where history will treat them very well as examples of the power of internet for good. And I just wanted to be part of it, especially given my background. And again, also, I wanted to learn a new business model, because that's how the McKinsey consultant in me, that's how I kind of stayed fresh and like challenged. And I had never done consumer internet, a for-profit for sure. I mean, Wikipedia, I was on the board, and it's a not-for-profit company. And so that's what drew me to it originally. And then, when I choose a company, it's people culture is number 1, market opportunity, product market fit, and then the role. And Quora nailed all of those for me, starting with the people and the culture. Adam D'Angelo is the CEO and founder, is one of my favorite people on the planet. I think the world of him. He is brilliant. He's probably the smartest person I've ever worked with. And I've worked with a lot of smart people. He's kind. He's just we had shared values, and he built a team that I could get around, and a product that I loved. And so for me, it was a no-brainer once I got introduced to the company. So that's how I chose it.
Let's actually go back to one of your comments about, how history will view certain actors, certain companies and whatnot. And let's chat about that actually. Obviously, the subject of content moderation versus free speech is something that is pretty live right now. I mean, obviously, these days, kind of Twitter, Elon Musk, that's in the news right now. I think a lot of people are thinking about that. So what did you mean specifically when you said, hey, I think Quora and Wikipedia did the right thing or doing the right thing? Is there a specific kind of message there?
Well, I think first of all, it's a noble mission, right? But if you want to talk about, if you want to get into the controversy of the product moderation, I'd be happy to. That's part of it, because I do think that they try to keep, it's very hard, but they try to keep true to the mission and keep quality content on the sites that are helping people, not hurting people, right? And so, but let's talk about it. So the product moderation team did report to me. That was the first for me, obviously. I mean, I was new to consumer internet, and this team ended up rolling into me very quickly.
Which is interesting, right? Rolling up into the office of the CFO. That's also pretty interesting. Okay.
Definitely not typical, but I think it was kind of more of like the COO type of capabilities that I built up over time that Adam trusted me with it. This is how we approached it at Quora. So it's kind of a four-legged stool. I think this is still valid today. You really have to start with a strong mission and then set policies and processes that match your mission. And so Quora's mission was to share and grow grow and share the world's knowledge base. That was helpful because it was all about knowledge, right? And so arguably Quora has an easier time to moderate than like a Facebook or a Twitter, because social media and the videos and the content that could come along with that, there's just a lot more gray space than there is in, is this knowledge or not, right? Once you know that, then the first step, the first leg of the stool is to set policy and process that supports, it's not one our mission, but one of our foundational principles is that we were not a free speech company. We understand the First Amendment, and in our reading, it doesn't apply to companies. It applies to people talking to the government, right? It doesn't apply to private companies controlling what is said or not said on their platform. So we were not a free speech company. That just wasn't in our DNA. We were about helping people. And so that helped us set very clear policies around harassment, bullying, child pornography, which did end up, some of this stuff happens on Quora, right? And even though it is a knowledge that these bad actors do play, but we had very clear lines where this is not acceptable. Either the content is out or it's deprioritized, and the bad actor is out or deprioritized, right? And so policy and process. And then the second thing is product. We tried to use as much ML and AI, machine learning and artificial intelligence, to make the product find exceptions to the policy and process. Not perfect, but getting better every day. And then the third leg is the community, kind of a self-policing community. We have terms of use. Both Quora and Wikipedia are blessed with passionate community members, as you are illustrating or personifying yourself. And so that self-policing helps, right? Because it's just a big network of people that are watching all the time. And then and servicing exceptions where the product is not catching things. And then finally, we had a team that reported to me that handled the exceptions and cues. There were cues for harassment, there were cues for bullying, there were cues for other things. And then if there was the exceptional shades of gray came up, then we had people, whether they're employees or contractors, handling those exceptions. So we didn't get it all right. No company does, but I feel like we're pretty good, right? And so, where I feel like there's going to be some backlash in the future is either companies not either through malice or through bad actors, or just through not having enough resources, time, or understanding the tiger that they've got by the tail, not handling these things. And then, having manipulation, whether it's false news or influencing legal elections in a bad way or helping genocide happen, whatever it is, not being able to stay on top of that won't be looked on, in my opinion, well. And if you want to talk about the free speech situation, I was pretty clear about that. I agree with Quora's view on that. And I also feel like I don't know a lot about Twitter's history, but what I've kind of read between the lines is they started out, if I'm right, as kind of more of like free speech is the way we want to go. And that didn't work out well for them. And then they spent a lot of time fixing the problems that caused. And so I'm very worried that if this deal goes through and a lot of this progress that Twitter's made, because I'm a big Twitter user and I think it's a very good way to consume information. I think it depends on how well you curate who you follow. And I think we know it, Captain Obvious here, but it's very impactful in this country about what's happening right now. And I'm worried that if the progress that Twitter has made over the last decade is undone by a misapplication of the First Amendment rights, that this country will be impacted. And so I think that's an example of where these companies are powerful and can go and can do things that are harmful for the country, the world.
That's fascinating. Clearly, I'm also a somewhat passionate Twitter user as well, so it definitely resonates. And then I think people probably do remember, right? I think 3 or 4 years ago, Reddit went through the exact same thing where there's a significant amount of controversy around this topic. And I think, everything up and down the board and CEO were, pretty significantly impacted by just all of the concerns around this. Last question on Quora before I'm done being a fanboy. Last question, which is back when I was active, right? For a few years back, I saw a lot of very high quality content from Quora employees. I don't know how they had the time to answer so many questions so thoughtfully, so well, and contribute, to the corpus of knowledge. Here's my question: did people were people on the clock when they did all of this stuff? Like when you were there and you were looking around, were people working and writing on Quora at the same time, or is that something they did in their own time? How did that? There was so much good content.
First of all, I think a lot of the people, Quora is kind of a written word culture. I mean, it's a mission-driven company. The beauty of a mission-driven company is that alignment is a lot easier, and a lot of people the employees aligned over how impactful the product can be in helping people in their lives. And so we never had rules around you must write this much content and you must do it here or there, or home or work. I just think people were passionate, and most people probably did it outside of their work hours, right? I mean, I know I did. Like I would, maybe after dinner one night, if somebody asked me an interesting question, I'd take an hour and write out an answer, because it's, it was, part of it is I did feel like it was more my job. Like I wrote a lot more when I was at Quora than I do now. Although I always want to write more on Quora, but I've just got so many other things to do. And it's so aligned, like, because you're using your own product, right? If you're trying to moderate, if you run the moderation team, you want to be on the product to see what's going on out there, right? If you ask questions or write answers, you see things that are going on in the user experience that may be great or bad. And so it's more on your mind and it's more integrated to your day-to-day job. But I think most Quorans are really passionate about the product and about writing and about growing and sharing the world's knowledge base. And so they're doing it because they love it, not because they need to be on the clock an hour during their 8-hour day, which is never the case anymore, right? No 8-hour days, but to get the content out.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for indulging me in all of these topics. I do want to pivot back to kind of the topic at hand, which is, for this season of the RAM podcast, we're trying to spend more time just thinking through business cycle, recession proofing, lessons learned, and whatnot. So I actually do want to touch on some of the other experiences that you've had over the arc of your career. So maybe we can kind of start backwards. Let's talk about the last couple of business cycles that you kind of lived through, whether it was 2009, the great financial crisis, or the dot-com era, the dot-com boom and bust. Maybe we can talk a little bit about just who were you at that point? What were you up to? And did you have any lessons learned about finance or leadership or running a business through some of these eras?
I've been out in the Bay Area for both of those cycles. And so I would say, while the 3 cycles that I've lived through, if you count the current one, have been caused by very different factors, there are certainly things that now as an old lady, I'm seeing these patterns emerge. And I would say that the pattern I've recognized and I've been thinking about the most in this go round is what I'll call the overreaction to the fear greed cycle. And this is a tech Bay Area biased answer, so I apologize for that. Although I think there's still lessons to be learned from this broadly. But I think because of the way that the tech investing works through the venture cycles or the venture process, you get this kind of dramatic fear greed cycle because a lot of VCs kind of follow each other in their sentiments. And so, in good times, that's the greed cycle. And then bad times, which arguably we're in right now, is kind of the fear cycle. What I've seen emerge is that during the greed cycles, companies are encouraged to spend because growth is the currency, right? And sometimes to unhealthy levels, like growth at all costs. And it's not just like the markets, it's the board, the investors. I've seen it now. And part of it is because if everybody else is doing it, you're going to fall behind if you're not also going for market share and doing this, right? And then you pivot to the fear cycles where it's all about like hyper analysis about every spend decision, every hire, RIFs, reduction of forces, like retooling, retrenching, et cetera. And I just think it's unhealthy. And so I feel like the advice, and I'm being sincere, I was giving this advice in the last year or two as I've joined boards. It's like, beware, because we were clearly in a long-term greed cycle. And I think the best companies are those that are disciplined during the greed cycles and then emerge with strength from the fear when you have a fear cycle. And I think you're going to see, fortunately, I think a lot of there are companies who are going to survive this just fine. And a lot of them are companies that just raised so much money in the last couple of years because it was so plentiful, like fundraising was so easy, quote unquote, and didn't spend it. And so now they're going to be able to come out with strong balance sheets in an environment where it's going to be easier to hire, although that's still not coming to fruition yet, but I think it will. Easier to hire, easier to take share, cheaper to take share, let's put it that way, and cheaper/easier to buy assets that are struggling, companies that didn't raise the money or raised it and spent it. And so I think that's kind of an example of emerging strong. And I think you're going to see companies that are burned, and now are going to struggle. And there's only so much you can do to get out of that in an extended cycle, which I think we may have. I mean, but so that to me, that's then the question is, how can finance help? So finance, at the end of the day, if I had to distill the role of a good finance leader, like a CFO, there are lots of finance leaders throughout a finance organization, but let's use the CFO as an example. The best CFOs are true business partners to the executive team and bringing to bear not proliferation of data, but synthesized information to help their business partners, their CEO, their board, their executive team, their extended teams make better decisions. To me, that's, if I had to distill it, that is the role of the CFO. And all companies, no matter how great, go through these cycles, right? And have problems. Like, there were days when I thought Ironport, which is incredibly successful, was going to die. It's how you get around these obstacles, how you get through these times that defines you, as whether it's a team, executive, person, et cetera. And I think really finance can help. Finance can bring to bear information, make these decisions easier. And where I think this really comes together most succinctly for me, or most viscerally for me as a CFO or a former CFO, is in the CEOs like to live in the future. Good CEOs live in the future. What's around the corner? What do we do about it? Bad finance people live in the past. They're always just closing the books, right? Closing the books is very important, but the most important thing is to close it efficiently and then learn from it. Take those lessons and apply them to the future with the CEO. And so, or the broader team. What does this mean? What have we closed and disclosed here? What have we learned, and what can we do about it? What are the key drivers in our business? What are we learning about those drivers and their performance? How can we optimize those drivers to optimize the future performance of the company? To me, that is the way you help get through these cycles, recession-proof your company as a CFO, is to be really disciplined and focused on those types of activities first and foremost. Yes, you can cost cut. Yes, you can mitigate risk. Yes, you can do this stuff. But at the end of the day, like, joining the CEO in the future and understanding the past, understanding what you can learn from it, understanding current performance, what it means for the future, what you need to do differently in the future, or what you need to double down on or stop doing. To me, that's how you do this right. Now, there's a lot in that. I'll say one other thing that ties together your Quora question and this question. I do think that finance has a very important role to play on setting the right culture on these things too, to make sure that you are, as a company, not just a finance team, disciplined during the good times and strong during the harder times. And let me give you a little anecdote here, not a war story, but an anecdote. So when I joined Quora, it was the first consumer internet company I'd been at, as I said. I knew a lot of people at other consumer internet companies. I knew about kind of the rich benefits that were provided to these companies. And I knew Quora kind of provided some of these too. And so I was like, but Quora wasn't public. Quora wasn't as far along at scale. And I was like, can we really afford this? Is this going to be, am I going to find this unreasonable, et cetera? And so I was running the facilities and IT teams as well. And I put myself purposefully into the queues for those two teams. So a lot of email about, fixing my PC and the garbage can is full here. But I wanted to see what the culture was like on these things. And I read these emails. I didn't read the ones about fixing the PCs, but I read the emails about special requests and the likes. And if something really bothered me, I would send it to the VP that was in charge of the team where it was being requested. And I would say, hey, can we talk about this? I went through this exercise many times with some of the VCPs around some of the more extreme requests. And I think it was a very good process for me because it helped me calibrate the Quora culture and get used to, as I was the oldest person in the company, or almost the second oldest person in the company, very different generation. I came from enterprise sales, so different culture. very product oriented versus sales oriented. And so it helped me calibrate the culture. And it also helped me point out in a data driven way things that I thought were too extreme with very data driven people. And it ended up, I think, helping the culture of Quora, because I think we didn't have a big problem, but we had some things that we needed to deal with and we dealt with them. And so that's an example for me about it's not just about the numbers. You can use your data driven approach to help impact culture as a finance person. And I think that helps set the right culture to have the right kind of sensibilities around the good times and the bad, so that you can help, have a lower beta when you go through these cycles. Right.
Any specific either experience or company that you've had that you think, looking back on it, wow, like the culture here was really good? Any one of these formative experiences that you want to call out, and just specific places where you were like, wow, very strong culture, really what, looking back on it, was really good?
For me, that answer is easy. It's like I always focus on people and culture, and it is, for me, most important criteria. And I think I've been very lucky. I think, first of all, that was as a young kid when I started here focusing on that. I think that was wise, but I'm a people person. I care a lot about it. And I think it's served me very well because I've been at companies that have been amazing. I mean, starting with companies like JP Morgan and McKinsey, which both had really great values and culture at the time, and then on. And then as an executive, helping to set it. But I'd have to say Ironport for me stands out. If you had to ask me like my most formative experience in my career, it would be Ironport, and partially because of culture. And so Ironport, when I joined, we had $1 million in bookings, and we took it. When we sold to Cisco, we had, I think it was 125 million going to 250. And I was only there during that. It was like, we went from 1 million in bookings to 125 million bookings in 4 years. I mean, it was insane, Alex. And this was the first time I'd ever done this. And so, I joked with Scott, the CEO, at one point that I felt like I was holding on to the back of a rocket engine, and I was holding on with my fingernails, and the fumes were blowing in my face. And I was just trying to hold on for dear life and not fall off. It was insane. And I learned so much. It was very stressful, but the first year of Ironport was probably the most valuable year of my entire career professionally. And why was that? Well, one, it did have an amazing culture. The CEO and the head of HR, Anna Binder, who's now the head of HR at Asana, she is one of the best, if not the best, HR executives I've ever seen in action. And they were in sync about setting early on, what's the mission, what are the values, what are the supporting processes that we want to use, whether it's performance management or, office decor, to support the culture. And it was just consistent from day one. And I'd have to say, one, I saw that culture can be not just a fun, make a fun party atmosphere, et cetera, which Ironport was tons of fun, but it was a competitive weapon. We had very low attrition. And this was when Google was putting up ads on billboards on 101 saying, solve this problem and you get a immediate job. And like, we're sucking talent everywhere. We had very low attrition, and we had high employee engagement before anybody talked about employee engagement. And then as a subtext or kind of a sub point for me, I think that the Ironport leadership team was probably the best leadership team I've ever worked with, arguably. And none of us had done it before. It was a bunch of smart people who didn't just apply what they'd done 5 times before, but thought through things from first principles and just really focused on what was the right thing for the business. And there was just a great leadership culture. And so it wasn't just the corporate culture, the leadership culture was amazing. And I think that leadership is something that you can't learn through reading a John Kotter book at business school. Like you really have to see good leadership in action, by osmosis, absorb it, then practice it and iterate it and see what works for you. And you can't just spout off leadership from other people. Like, you have to find what authentically works for you. But I think seeing different styles and really strong leadership, and then learning by kind of watching and then practicing, is the way to learn leadership. And I feel like Ironport was an amazing place, not just to learn how to scale a company under duress, which I definitely learned that too, and that's very valuable, but about the importance of culture as a competitive weapon, and about how to lead, how to really learn leadership. And so that's advice I'd give to young people, like, focus on, don't read a book about leadership, or read a book, but then like just find a great leadership team and watch them. And that's why I think sometimes smaller companies, because you see more leadership in action. That's closer up.
That comment, there was an earlier comment, and then you actually just made that comment again just now. So small versus large company, or maybe we can talk about, private versus public, right? You were at Cisco for a little bit. You were at HP, larger scale companies, and then a whole slew of kind of smaller businesses. So You have stated, right? You clearly have a preference for being at one of these smaller companies, private companies. Maybe compare and contrast, and why the preference, and maybe we can delve into what is it about certain characteristics that you want to optimize for that leads you to, some of these private, smaller companies versus the larger public ones.
Well, I think a lot of it depends on your personality. There's no right answer for any one person. But for me, I'll talk about how I approached it and why I feel that way, and then people can kind of see if it resonates with them. But so first of all, I am a very hands-on doer. Like that's one of the reasons I didn't love McKinsey, right? The work. I loved the company, but I didn't love being a consultant. I really like to be part of the team. I like to dig into spreadsheets. I like to really I love to lead and manage, but I don't mind even at my age and my tenure, I don't mind getting in and being an individual contributor and building a spreadsheet or writing a paper or whatever and writing a Quora answer. I mean, whatever it is. And so I think that personality trait lends itself more to kind of the smaller company experience. I'm from a family of entrepreneurs. And so I just feel like you feel more entrepreneurial when you're at a smaller company. But I have to say, like, the thing that I learned once that's why I was drawn to a smaller company. But what I learned when I was actually at a smaller company is that you just see more learnings. Like you're less in your silo, right? And you're more cross-functionally aware because it's just a smaller environment where you're naturally seeing other people in action, working across, especially when like smaller companies usually can't afford to keep you in your silo. Like if you can do this, go do it. We have more work to do than there is people to do it. And so you just naturally see more people in action across functional lines, and you more naturally wear more hats, get to do more things outside of your scope, right? If you go to a big company in finance, you're going to do a 2-year rotation in 5 different groups before you have a cross-functional view of finance. Maybe, not always, but maybe. Whereas in my first year at Ironport, I feel like I saw it all. Like it was just because it was crazy. I mean, sometimes I didn't like it because I was so swamped, stressed, and busy. But it was uncomfortable, right? But I just saw I feel like I learned, I got a PhD level of finance in 1 year versus spending 10 years doing 5 2-year rotations. Right now I'm being hyperbolic or, extreme here. And so I just think that if you're a sponge and a learner and you want to, you want that kind of atmosphere, you're just naturally going to find it at a smaller company, right? Not always. Like now, I will say that early in my career, I did go to big companies, right? I mean, I was at very big companies. And the advantage there is when there's brands are easier, it's less risky to choose, right? You have more information to make your choice about the brand, the financial health, et cetera. 2, they can spend more money. Remember the whole natural athlete versus like been there, done that argument I got when I tried to get my first startup job. They can spend money on training you that a startup's not going to spend. And they also have training programs where like my JP Morgan training program was like 60 people. I'm still close with those people. Like it was, or some of them anyway. And so it's like it was like this very social learning environment, but also working. And so there are advantages, especially early in your career, to going to big companies. For my personality, I got to the point where I liked being at smaller companies because I felt like I could have more impact. I learn more. Culturally, also, even though I'm a CFO, I do not like process. I like to put in the lightest touch process at the very last minute you need to put it in because process slows down companies. And so that doesn't go over well in bigger companies, right? That's much more of a startup mentality. And so I think that was just a natural fit for me. And so, I don't like hierarchy and politics and, all that stuff. And so I feel like, there's just more accountability in smaller companies often. And I don't like massive stereotypes, but often. And so it just appealed to my sentiments and cultural sensibilities too. And also they're just fun. I enjoy the growth, the whiteboard, and so it just, smaller companies eventually I got to the point in my career where smaller companies were just a better bet for me.
I think that's a really good encapsulation. I'll be honest, a lot of what you described really resonates with me as well. I mean, I started my career at Morgan Stanley, analyst program, very nice training experience, good training grounds for the future in finance, et cetera, et cetera. And then lo and behold, right, the last couple of years of sitting in this operating seat here at Ramp, running finance and building out some amount of process, right, has been incredible. And it is very much hopefully impactful, and definitely I'm drinking out of a fire hose every single day. So I think there's a lot that of what you described that resonates with me. I do want to delve into one last topic before we run out of time, and that is really your sort of current role and position, and with respect to how you're supporting some of these companies, which is sitting on boards. So this is a topic that we historically haven't had a ton of time to delve into, at least on the podcast. So would love to hear a little bit about your experience. And I'm sure as a CFO, you've previously been on the other end of it, which is managing board relationships from the operating side. But would love to hear a little bit about just the experience of sitting on boards, the good, the bad, any interesting key takeaways, and any advice you might have for operators who are potentially managing to some of these board relationships.
Well, first of all, I'll start with the end, which is advice. I would say get on a board if you can, even if as a full-time exec, because I think it makes you a better executive. When you're a full-time exec, especially in an intense startup or private company, scaling a company, you can get tunnel vision. And I think having another company and seeing from a bird's eye view what they're going through gives you perspective, context, learnings, and you start building your pattern recognition. So I would say as soon as you can, get on a board. Now, getting a board seat, the first one's always the hardest, especially public company board seat. And so I would say be patient and network, because a lot of these positions are really, unfortunately, still through networking. And so, I think I say unfortunately because I think that works against diversity candidates, which is obviously a big problem in US corporate governance world. But work the network and do not for profits. Like for me, Wikipedia was like probably the most complicated organization. I think Wikipedia is the most complicated organization, non-government organization, maybe on the planet in the United States. Like it's just so complicated. And so that, even though that was a not-for-profit board seat, it's a top 10 brand and a very complicated learning environment. And so that was hugely valuable. So if you can get a not-for-profit board seat, like I've been on a ski resort for 25 years, I've learned stuff there that I can apply to tech companies, right? And so, even if it's not core in your business, like don't be too picky about some things, right? Just get on a board and get the practice. Because once you get the first one, the rest are easier. I would say that, back to choosing boards. So I use that framework. I mentioned the framework, people culture is number one, market opportunity, product market fit, and kind of stage. And then the role. Those are my four priority order things that I do due diligence on and I judge before I take an opportunity. And I company or board. And I would say for a board, that's still very relevant. And I think that in some ways, board seats are. So first of all, I would focus on those things, do due diligence before you make your choice. In some ways, joining a board is even riskier than taking a job, right? Because especially a public company board, there is risk if things go south, right? And financial, legal, et cetera. In some ways, it's less risky because you can diversify, right? Like you've got one full-time job, one slot, unless you're superhuman, you have one slot for a full-time job, unless you're Elon Musk, or Jack Dorsey, you have one slot for a full-time job, right? You can do multiple boards. Now, if you're working full time, I would say don't do more than maybe two. Two's pushing it, in my opinion. And I've got a lot of energy, but you can diversify. And so in some ways that's less risky. Like because you can kind of split your upside. Like I said, I'm on two larger companies, two medium-sized companies, two small companies on their boards. If you just focus on tech boards, one public, 5 private, 2 are infrastructure, 2 are SaaS, 2 are consumer. And so that diversification is intellectually stimulating, it's fun, and financially it's smart, right? But I'd say the number one thing in this is because of the risk of joining a board and their long-term commitments, really do your due diligence on the people. Seriously, like do everything you can. Blind reference them, read their answers on Quora, watch their interviews on YouTube, see if you can find stuff on social media about them. Like learn about these people and make sure you want to be around them and you trust them before you join the boards. It's easier when you've got venture capitalists on the board and they're bigger companies. Maybe harder when you've got kind of more independence, but just make sure, and I'm talking about the board members and the executive team, right? Make sure that you trust them and that you want to spend this time with them. The other thing I'd say about you asked a lot of questions about the board. The other thing I'd say is I was worried about joining boards too early. I always thought I'd kind of want to do this. And I ended up leaving Quora because I had a health problem that took 6 months to get through, and I'm totally fine. But I was planning on staying at Quora. I always knew it'd be my last CFO job, but I was planning on staying there much longer. When I got through my health situation, I've been asked to join the Arista board while I was recuperating. So I thought I'll do a little A/B test. I'll do a board. I'll take on another board seat, and I'll do like a temp CFO role and just test because I am a doer who likes to be part of the team, didn't like being a consultant. I was worried that boards were going to feel like that. And what I learned through my A/B test is that I was ready. And what I've found about being a board member is that for me, for my personality, because you are part of a long-term team and you are still helping scale and build a company, albeit not as directly, for me, it's satisfying. I don't feel like I'm a consultant coming in and leaving, right? I do feel like I'm part of the team and it really, engaged in helping and learning, et cetera. And so I've found it to be very gratifying and fun.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I think that's an area that comes up from, it's from time to time, but we actually never were able to do a deep dive like the one that we just did. In fact, on one of your earlier points, I actually did have another kind of CFO that I was interviewing at a prior episode, and the two of us were lamenting the ever skyrocketing cost of D&O insurance. Actually,
Yes,
speaking of kind of financial, legal, regulatory liabilities and whatnot, I think that's also been a thing that insurance
it's
underwriters,
definitely a thing.
you have escalating SPACs, right? You have a lot of just folks being much more circumspect about
Yeah,
paying for
yeah,
such insurance. So clearly there is a trend. They're just
yeah,
toward being a little bit more careful on
yeah.
that front.
Yeah. One other thing I'd say in terms of advice on boards is, in the words of Sheryl Sandberg, lean in. Like, you're not going to be perfectly qualified, especially your first board. And so you just really have to lean into how you can help. And being an exec at a company, you have board experience. You're just on the other side of the table. And in some ways that's harder because you're having to deal with your board instead of being dealt with. And so figure out the 5 or 6 selling points of like what you can add. Like right now, ESG and cyber are going to be more and more important on boards. And if you're a cyber ESG expert in a company, you're going to be in high demand 2 years when the SEC clarifies what's needed in terms of governance on this stuff. And so lean into that, but just figure out how you can add value and get your talking points and then lean in and realize that nobody's perfectly qualified and everybody's got to get their first one somehow.
One question I always like to sort of wrap up with is 2022 has been a little bit of a wild ride, right? Markets, crazy inflation, there's stuff going on in Europe and whatnot. Would love to hear a little bit about for yourself over the course of the balance of the year or into next year. What are you most looking forward to? Is there anything that you're optimistic about? Even though, the rest of the market, apparently thinks there's going to be a hard landing and whatever macro, recession there may be. What are you focused on these days and what are you looking forward to?
Well, for me, the thing I'm looking forward to, and if you're talking about work, not personally, I'm looking forward to the world kind of getting normalized after COVID. People person, I love being around people. I am really I joined 5 boards during COVID, and only now am I actually meeting people live. And I am finding that to be fun. I'm in my parents' house in Florida right now, which is the fish photos, but paintings, but like just being able to travel again. I mean, I did some travel, but and feel safer about it. Like to me, while we still have realities of COVID and I've been super conservative and careful about it, I'm really looking forward to us getting past this pandemic and just even the professional and social ramifications of the isolation that we've all been through.
Absolutely. I think we're all looking forward to traveling a little bit more, hitting the road, being back in the office to some extent, at least. Very cool. Very cool. Well, Kelly, it was really great to have you here. I cannot believe that we spent the first 20 minutes talking about Quora, but such is life. It was great. And then all of your, observations about kind of team building culture as well as sitting on boards, really, really tremendous. Really good to have you once again on the podcast. It's been awesome.
It's my pleasure, Alex. It's so nice to get to spend the time with you today.